Let's talk about what's holding people back. What is this inner critic? What does it do to us? How does it make us feel? What have you seen? Take it away, brother.
So yeah, let's talk about the inner critic. And I'll just kind of use this as an entry point to how I got into podcasting. I was in the music business for a long time, 10, 15 years, and had a couple of kids. And being that the music business, particularly on a local level, is not necessarily the fulcrum of commerce, I decided that I was getting out of the music business. So I got a square job and sat at a desk and started dreaming about making my own business, which was great. It ended up really good for me. Music was awesome, but I needed the change. The problem that I didn't foresee is that it was very difficult to, one, kind of like escape my identity as a musician. And even more so was to kind of like be away from the camaraderie of having a band. I was used to having these 5 or 6 guys that were just my ride or die brothers that I'd see them a couple of times a week. And, the really fun aspect of having a band is just talking trash over beers with your buddies. All this was brand new to me. So I broke off with the band, quit my gig working as a music promoter, and basically was alone with my family, which was wonderful. Those little babies were amazing. But at this time, the job I took was in Superior. So at the time I was living in Lone Tree. So I'm driving from Lone Tree to Superior, which is just south of Boulder a little bit. It was like 90-minute commute. I burned out my playlist really quickly. And honestly, I couldn't really listen to much music because I was still kind of so like damaged by the music industry that I needed something else. This is probably 2007, 2008, right around the time of iPhone 2. So I heard about podcasts. This is when you still had to like hook it up to your computer and download the show into your phone. And I started falling in love with podcasts. This was like when Rogan was still interviewing people in his like bedroom. I mean, this goes way back, and I loved it. Not only did it just seem to like keep me entertained in the traffic.
So you started listening to podcasts basically when podcasts first came out, like first when it was even being a thing, you were already part of the listening side. Okay.
Pretty early. I started listening, I was turned on to podcasting largely because you could search categorically. So it was very similar to like that eye-opening moment when you got an iPhone and you're like, wow, there's an app for everything. It was like, oh, there's a podcast for everything. So I started really diving into these different areas that I was interested in, whether that be comedy or sports, or there's a great series called Field of Weeds from a Korean Zen monk that I loved, Henry Grevenberg. Shout out. I know he's out there somewhere. So I just started like really exploring podcast landscape, became obsessed with it. And honestly, it kind of took me out of like a blue spot. I was feeling down. I had a lot of pressure and had this big life change, and it made me feel better. So anyway, I'm like, you know what? My buddy's got a music studio. I could record a podcast. And so I called the boys in the band, and we're like, hey, you guys want to get together? They're like, yeah. You want to get the band back together? I'm like, oh, no. I just
music, no music.
Yeah, I want to do everything from band practice, just without instruments. So just like, we're just going to get beers. We're going to hang out. It's going to be fun. So I started a podcast called 8th Grade Ball at that time.
Wait a second. So how many podcasts have you had, and or the name of them? Because I already knew Denver Business Podcast, which you later rebranded. Is this that same podcast that was rebranded again, or is this a different podcast?
This was my first podcast, which I never rebranded. I just let it go.
Okay. What year was that? Like
that was probably 2008.
All right. So if you're listening, Ryan has started a podcast in 2008, right before the crash. And I started my first podcast 9 years later. 9 years
Nice.
later. So you got some history, you got some experience. So I'm looking forward to letting the listener know from all of your experience. So 2008, you decide to get with your buddies, have some beers, do all the stuff that you would do in the band, but with no instruments. Take it from there. Where were we?
You bet. Right there. So we're doing it in a recording studio with like German microphones and $200 headphones. I mean, it was a very well-produced podcast, and just having a ball, telling stories, ragging on each other. This, again, like Rogan is ubiquitous with podcasting, and he's got a 500 gazillion downloads. But back then he was like he was a real originator. And so there was, at the time, Brian Redband was like the producer of the show, and he created this thing called Death Squad Podcast Network. And so there were kind of like different pods of podcasts around the country that were doing similar inspired shows, but also all together on Twitter. And all the people in podcasting at the time kind of doing irreverent kind of guerrilla radio type stuff were all kind of a tight-knit community. So doing the show, promoting it on Twitter was big at the time. Twitter was brand new. The show grew in popularity pretty well and pretty quickly. So I did that show for a long time. time, which started out with my band buddies, and then it became kind of an interview podcast. I started interviewing a lot of people in MMA. I train jiu-jitsu here in Denver and have forever. So I'd bring in local fighters and comedians and musicians. And really, it did just become an extension of my experience in the entertainment industry, which is just having interesting people and like hanging out parlor style. So I had that show for a long time. And then my media and marketing agency kind of took root. I saw the utility of these conversations. I saw that like, not only was I having these really interesting conversations with people, but I was realizing that some of the problems that they were having, I could solve through my business.